Wyoming Territory, 1885. The dust of redemption was a living thing. It rose in fine, golden plumes with every gust of wind that swept down from the granite mountains, coating the raw timber of the buildings in a pale film and settling in the creases of a man's soul. Sheriff Caleb Blackwood knew its taste, its grit, its permanence. It was the taste of his life, a constant reminder of the dry, solitary existence he had carved for himself in the heart of this unforgiving land. He stood on the porch of his office, a solid shape against the bleached afternoon sun, his thumbs hooked into his belt. His gaze swept the length of Main Street, a familiar and unchanging vista. The saloon, the general store, the livery, the smithy. Each building was a post in the fence he had built around his world. He was a man constructed from the same hard materials as the mountains that loomed over the town. His shoulders were broad, his frame lean and corded with the kind of strength that came not from lifting weights in a gymnasium, but from wrestling life into submission day after day. A dark stubble shadowed his jaw, a jaw that was perpetually set in a firm line. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. They saw the twitch of a curtain in a window, the way a horse favored its left foreleg, the nervous tick of a stranger stepping into the saloon. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and had learned that survival depended on vigilance, on keeping the world at arm's length. Inside him, there was a quiet place, a vast and empty prairie where memories were buried like stones. He did not visit it often. The memory of his wife, Sarah, her laughter like the chime of a silver bell, and his son, Thomas, his small hand tucked into his own, those memories were locked away. To remember was to feel, and to feel was to invite a pain that had once nearly shattered him like river ice under a hammer blow. He had learned his lesson. A man alone was a fortress. A man with attachments was a target. Love was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor, and he had sealed every crack with resolve and routine. His routine was the bedrock of his existence. Dawn patrol, coffee at the diner, paperwork, settling disputes over fences and water rights, and the long, quiet evenings spent cleaning his rifle, the scent of gun oil, a familiar, sterile perfume. The silence of his small house on the edge of town was a comfort, a thick blanket against the noise of the world and the louder noise of his own thoughts. His housekeeper, Martha, a sturdy widow with kind eyes and a tongue as sharp as a skinning knife, would come and go, leaving meals and a sense of order, but she knew better than to pry into the locked rooms of his heart. A distant sound pricked his attention, a low, mournful whistle that cut through the steady moan of the wind. The train. It was the only thing that regularly broke the monotony, a metal serpent breathing steam and noise, linking their isolated world to the bustling, distant east. It came twice a week, bringing mail, supplies, and the occasional foolhardy soul seeking a new life. Caleb watched them come, and, more often than not, watched them go. Their dreams crumbled to the same dust that covered everything else. He felt a familiar, weary cynicism settle over him. Redemption offered no redemption, offered hardship, and a man had to be hard to endure it. The whistle grew louder, a promise of arrival. Down the street, Jed, the station master, emerged from his office, wiping his hands on an oily rag. A few townspeople drifted toward the platform, their curiosity a weekly ritual. Caleb remained where he was, an observer. The train was a disruption, a temporary tear in the fabric of his controlled world. He preferred to watch it from a distance, to see the pieces settle back into place once it had departed, leaving only a lingering trail of smoke against the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. He had no interest in what it brought. He had everything he needed right here. His duty, his solitude, his silence. Or so he told himself, every single day. The lie was as familiar and necessary as the Colt peacemaker that rested, heavy and solid, on his hip. As the locomotive chugged into view, a black beast of iron and steam, its rhythmic chuffing growing into a deafening roar, Caleb felt an unbidden and unwelcome flicker of something else. Not curiosity, but a strange, hollow premonition like the stillness in the air before a lightning strike. He dismissed it as nonsense, a trick of the wind. He was the sheriff. He was a fortress, and nothing the train could deliver from that other world could ever breach his walls. The hiss of the steam brakes was a long, drawn-out sigh as the train shuddered to a halt, and the life he had so carefully constructed held its breath. Eleanor Vance stepped down from the passenger car, her foot sinking slightly into the loose dirt of the platform. She felt the oppressive heat first, a dry, baking warmth that was nothing like the humid summers of Philadelphia. Then came the light, so bright and unfiltered it made her squint, reflecting off a world that seemed painted in shades of brown and ochre. The dust, just as the letters had described, was everywhere, a fine powder that immediately clung to the hem of her deep blue traveling dress. She clutched the handle of her valise, her knuckles white, and took a deep, steadying breath that filled her lungs with the unfamiliar scents of sagebrush, horse, and hot metal. She was a stark contrast to her surroundings, a delicate porcelain figure set down in a blacksmith shop. Her hair, the color of spun honey, was neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, though rebellious strands had already escaped to frame a face that was all fine lines and intelligent grace. Her eyes, a clear, thoughtful gray, scanned the small crowd, searching for the face from the photograph, the face of Mr. Silas Croft. The photograph had shown a man with kind eyes and a promising smile, a man who had written of prosperity, of a fine house he was building for her, of a new life under the wide Wyoming sky. His letters had been her lifeline, a rope thrown to her as she drifted in the lonely sea left by her parents' passing. But the kind eyes and promising smile were nowhere to be found. The faces that looked back at her were weathered and curious, some friendly, some openly staring at her fine clothes and city pallor. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. He had promised, sworn in his last letter, that he would be right here on the platform, waiting. She performed another slow, deliberate scan of the area, her hope beginning to fray like the edge of an old map. There was the station master, a harried-looking man directing the unloading of crates. There were a few cowboys, leaning against a post, their expressions unreadable beneath the shadows of their hats. And there was a man standing on the porch of the sheriff's office, tall and still as a sentinel, watching everything with an unnerving intensity. Minutes bled into a quarter of an hour. The train gave a final, groaning hiss and began to pull away, its departure feeling like a final severance from everything she had ever known. The small crowd dispersed, their curiosity sated, returning to their daily routines. She was left alone on the platform with her trunk and her valise, the Wyoming wind tugging at her skirt, a solitary figure in a vast, empty landscape. The knot in her stomach was now a cold, heavy stone. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her composure. Caleb had watched the entire scene unfold. He had seen her step from the train, a splash of color in a monochrome world. He had noted the determined set of her chin, the way she surveyed the platform with a hope that slowly, visibly, curdled into confusion and then fear. He knew the look. It was the look of someone who had gambled everything on a promise and had just discovered the dice were loaded. He had seen it before. He felt a familiar surge of irritation mixed with a reluctant pity. This was not his business. He was the law, not a guardian for naive Eastern women who believed fanciful tales written on cheap stationery. And yet, he did not turn away. He watched as she approached the station master, Jed, and saw the man shake his head, his expression a mixture of sympathy and helplessness. He could guess the conversation. Silas Croft? Haven't seen him in weeks. Heard he lit out for California, or worse. He saw the woman's shoulders slump, a subtle but devastating collapse of her posture. She stood for a long moment, simply staring down the empty tracks, the symbol of her abandoned hope. He should go back inside. He should finish his paperwork. But his feet, of their own accord, carried him off the porch and across the dusty street. He stopped a few feet from her, his shadow falling over her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. She startled, spinning around to face him. Her eyes were wide, the gray irises shimmering with unshed tears, but she blinked them back with a fierce pride that he found interesting. "You're looking for someone?" he stated. It was not a question. "I am," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor he could see in her hands. "I was to be met by a Mr. Silas Croft." She lifted her chin, as if daring him to pass judgment. Caleb's expression did not change, but something hardened in his eyes. He knew the name. Silas Croft was a weasel of a man who drifted into town 6 months prior, full of big talk about land speculation and investments. He'd run up a considerable tab at the saloon and a line of credit at the general store before disappearing 2 weeks ago, leaving a trail of angry creditors in his wake. "Silas Croft is gone, ma'am," he said, his tone flat and final. "Left town. Owed a lot of people money." The last of the color drained from her face. Her carefully constructed composure shattered like glass against stone. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She swayed on her feet, the world tilting into a dizzying blur of dust and sun. Caleb moved without thinking, his reflexes honed by years of reacting to sudden danger. He closed the distance in a single stride, his hands reaching out to steady her, one hand gripping her upper arm, the other landing firmly on her back. The contact was like a jolt of lightning. Through the fabric of her dress, he could feel the delicate bones of her shoulder, the warmth of her skin. She was so slight, so fragile under his calloused hands. She smelled of lavender and travel, a scent so foreign in his world of leather and dust that it was momentarily disorienting. For a brief, unguarded second, he was aware of nothing but the woman in his arms, the fine tremor that ran through her, the sheer, unexpected reality of her. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to his chest to steady herself. She looked up into his face, into those stormy, unreadable eyes. She felt the strength in his grip, a solid, grounding force in her spinning world. His touch was not gentle, but it was sure. It was the touch of a man who knew how to hold things, how to keep them from breaking. In that moment of accidental, forced intimacy, her carefully planned future dissolved completely, leaving only the terrifying, uncertain present and the unyielding presence of the sheriff of redemption. He released her as quickly as he had grabbed her, stepping back and creating a formal, necessary distance between them. The warmth of his touch lingered on her arm. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, his voice returning to its gruff, impersonal tone. "Yes," she whispered, though it was a lie. She was far from all right. She was stranded, deceived, and utterly alone in a place that felt more like the surface of the moon than a part of her own country. She straightened her spine, pulling the tattered remnants of her dignity around her like a shawl. "Thank you, Sheriff." She had seen the star pinned to his vest. "It seems I have been misinformed." The understatement was vast, a chasm of foolish hope and bitter reality. Caleb gave a curt nod. He looked at her trunk, then at her face, pale and strained beneath the brim of her hat. He saw not just a damsel in distress, a type he generally had little patience for, but a woman of substance trying desperately not to fall apart. The practical part of his mind took over the part that dealt with problems. A stranded woman in a town like Redemption was a problem. She had no money, no connections. She would be vulnerable. It was his duty to deal with it. It was just duty. "You have a place to stay?" he asked, the question clipped. She shook her head, the movement small and defeated. "Mr. Croft wrote that he had secured lodgings for me." Another lie from a man she had never even met. The humiliation of it was a hot flush on her cheeks. Caleb considered the town's only boarding house, run by a notorious gossip, and the hotel above the saloon, which was no place for a woman like her. Both were unacceptable. A heavy sigh escaped him, stirring the dust at his feet. This was a complication he did not need, a disruption to the quiet order of his life. But he was the sheriff. The responsibility, heavy and unwelcome, was his. "Come with me," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He bent down, grabbing her heavy trunk with one hand and her valise with the other, as if they weighed nothing. "You can stay at my house for the night. My housekeeper, Martha, is there. We'll figure out what's to be done in the morning." He did not wait for her reply. but turned and began walking, his long strides forcing her to hurry to keep pace. Eleanor followed in his wake, a swirl of conflicting emotions buffeting her. She was frightened, humiliated, and deeply wary of this hard, silent man. Yet, as she watched him carry her worldly possessions, his back straight and unyielding, she also felt a tiny, flickering ember of something else. Gratitude, and perhaps, just perhaps, a sliver of security in a world that had suddenly turned treacherous. She had come to Wyoming seeking a home and had found only deceit. Now she was following a stranger to his house, her future a complete and terrifying blank. Caleb's house was at the far end of the street, set back a little from the others, as if it, too, preferred a certain distance. It was a simple, sturdy structure of clapboard and stone, with a porch that wrapped around the front. It was immaculately kept, the yard free of weeds, the windows clean. It spoke of order and discipline, a reflection of the man himself. He led her inside, the interior cool and dim after the glare of the sun. The air smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and brewing coffee. A woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She was in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled into a severe bun, but her eyes were warm and shrewd. "Caleb, what in heaven's name?" Her words trailed off as she saw Eleanor standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Martha, this is Miss—" Caleb paused, realizing he hadn't even asked her name. "Vance," Eleanor supplied softly. "Eleanor Vance, Miss Vance," he continued, setting her luggage down. "She's been left stranded. She'll be staying in the guest room tonight." He delivered the information as a field report, devoid of emotion or explanation. Martha's gaze flickered from Caleb's stony face to Eleanor's pale, exhausted one. She took in the fine but travel-worn dress, the expensive-looking trunk, and the look of quiet desperation in the young woman's eyes. A lifetime of reading people allowed her to grasp the situation in an instant. Her expression softened with a compassion that Caleb rarely showed. "Of course. You poor dear. Come in. You look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed." She bustled forward, taking Eleanor's arm and guiding her further into the house, her touch warm and reassuring. "Don't you pay any mind to him," she said in a conspiratorial whisper, loud enough for Caleb to hear. "He has all the social graces of a badger." Caleb ignored the comment, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "I'll be at the office," he said to no one in particular. And then he was gone, retreating back to the familiar solitude of his duties, leaving Eleanor in the capable, motherly hands of his housekeeper. He told himself he had done his duty, nothing more. He had provided temporary shelter. Tomorrow, he would arrange for her passage on the next train east, and his life would return to its predictable, orderly rhythm. But as he walked back down the dusty street, he could not shake the scent of lavender from his senses, nor the feeling of her fragile warmth against his hands. The fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a quiet, desperate need he had been unable to ignore. Later that evening, the house was quiet. A fire crackled in the hearth of the main room, casting a warm, flickering light on the simple, masculine furnishings. Polished wood, worn leather, and a shelf of books that looked well-read. After a simple but hearty meal of stew and fresh bread prepared by Martha, Eleanor felt some of her strength return. Martha had shown her to a small, clean guest room with a comfortable bed and a pitcher of water for washing, treating her with a kindness that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. Now, dressed in a simple nightgown and robe, she sat in a chair by the fire, nursing a cup of chamomile tea Martha had insisted upon. Caleb sat opposite her, his long legs stretched out, his boots crossed at the ankle. He had been cleaning his rifle, the methodical, repetitive motions seeming to be a form of meditation for him. The sharp, clean scent of the gun oil mingled with the wood smoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken questions. He had finished his task, and now sat watching the flames, his face a mask of shadows and light. "I'm deeply grateful for your hospitality, Sheriff," Eleanor said, her voice soft in the quiet room. "I don't know what I would have done." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Martha wouldn't have had it any other way. He deflected the gratitude, placing it on his housekeeper. It was his way. She is a very kind woman, Eleanor agreed. She hesitated, then decided that the truth, however humiliating, was all she had left. I feel I owe you an explanation. I answered an advertisement. A mail-order bride. She said the words plainly, without shame. Mr. Croft's letters, they painted a very different picture of this town. Of his circumstances, Caleb's gaze shifted from the fire to her face. He saw no foolishness there, only a grave honesty. People lie, he said, the words simple and hard. Especially when they want something. I suppose I was naive, she admitted, looking down at her hands, which were clasped around the warm mug. Back home, in Philadelphia, a person's words still hold some meaning. My parents passed 2 years ago. I had no family left, and my prospects were limited. His offer seemed like a chance for a new beginning. A home, a family. The last words were barely a whisper, a confession of her deepest, most vulnerable longing. Caleb felt an unwelcome echo in his own chest. Home, family. The words were ghosts that haunted the empty rooms of his life. He had had both once. He had had a life filled with laughter and warmth, and he had watched it all turn to ash. He looked at this woman, with her refined speech and her quiet dignity, and saw a loneliness that mirrored his own, though hers was born of circumstance, and his was a deliberate, self-imposed exile. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The quiet intimacy of the moment, the shared warmth of the fire, seemed to loosen something in him, a stone that had been lodged in his throat for years. He found himself speaking, his own voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to another man. I had a family once, he said, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. A wife, Sarah, and a son, Thomas. Eleanor looked up, her own sorrow momentarily forgotten. She saw the raw pain that flickered in his eyes before he could shield it again. She remained silent, sensing that this was a rare and fragile confidence, a story that needed to be heard, not interrupted. It was the fever, he continued, his voice low and devoid of inflection, a man reporting facts to keep the feeling at bay. Took them both within a week of each other. 5 years ago. Thomas was only 4". He paused, and in the silence, Eleanor could hear the unspoken agony of a father who had been helpless to save his child. This land, it gives, but it takes more. It demands a strength I didn't have back then. I learned a lesson. Attachments make you weak. They give fate a target. I am so sorry, she whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. She saw him now not as a hard, intimidating sheriff, but as a man hollowed out by grief, a man who had built his fortress of solitude on a foundation of profound loss. His stoicism was not a lack of feeling. It was a dam holding back an ocean of it. There's nothing to be sorry for, he said, his tone becoming clipped again as he retreated from the memory. It's the way of things, is it? She challenged gently, her voice gaining a surprising strength. Or is it simply easier to believe that? To believe that love and connection are weaknesses, rather than the only things that give us the strength to endure the hardships. She was no longer just a stranded woman from the East. She was speaking from her own experience of loss, from the deep well of her own lonely heart. Her question hung in the air between them, sharp and clear. It was a direct challenge to the creed he had lived by for 5 years. He had no answer for it. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the city clothes and the refined manners. He saw a resilience that matched the landscape outside, a quiet strength forged in her own fire of grief. She was not the delicate thing he had first assumed. There was steel in her spine. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt a flicker of connection to another person, a sense of shared understanding that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. He stood abruptly, the moment becoming too intense, too close. It's late, he said, his voice gruff once more. You should get some rest. The train east leaves in 2 days. I'll make the arrangements for your ticket in the morning. He was already rebuilding the wall, putting the distance back between them. He was sending her away, back to the world where she belonged. It was the right thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. Eleanor watched him go, his broad back disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. She felt a pang of disappointment, so sharp it surprised her. He was offering her an escape, a return to the familiar. But for the first time, the thought of Philadelphia felt like a retreat, not a homecoming. In this harsh, dusty town, in the quiet company of this wounded man, she had shared more of her true self than she had with anyone in years. He thought he was sending her away for her own good, but she wondered if he was really just trying to protect himself. She finished her tea, the warmth spreading through her, and knew one thing with a sudden, startling certainty. She did not want to go. The next 2 days passed in a strange state of suspension. Caleb was a distant but constant presence. He bought her ticket for the eastbound train, placing it on the hall table without a word, a silent, final decree. He spent his days at the sheriff's office, immersing himself in his duties, deliberately avoiding the house and the woman who had so thoroughly disrupted his peace. Yet, he found his thoughts drifting to her constantly. He pictured her talking with Martha in the kitchen, her voice a low, pleasant murmur against the clatter of pots and pans. He imagined her sitting on the porch in the evening, reading one of his books, her brow furrowed in concentration. These images were unwelcome intruders in the stark landscape of his mind. Eleanor, for her part, tried to make herself useful. She helped Martha with the cooking and cleaning, her hands, accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, quickly learning the rhythm of kneading dough and scrubbing floors. She refused to be a helpless guest. She was proving to herself, and perhaps to the sheriff, that she was not made of glass. She explored the small town, walking the length of Main Street with a determined stride. She endured the curious stares of the townspeople, responding with a polite nod and a quiet dignity that discouraged gossip. She was adapting, her roots beginning to seek purchase in the dry, unpromising soil. She also saw the underbelly of the town's life. The hard-bitten cowboys who drank too much at the saloon, the weary-eyed women who worked tirelessly, the ever-present thread of casual violence that shimmered in the air like heat haze. And she saw the respect they all had for their sheriff. When Caleb walked the street, a hush fell. Disputes were brought to him, his word taken as law. He was the pillar that held this fragile community together, a man who carried the weight of it all on his solitary shoulders. Her admiration for him grew, even as his emotional distance frustrated her. On the afternoon before her scheduled departure, trouble arrived in the form of 2 men who rode into town. They were not cowboys or prospectors. They were hard-faced and wore their guns tied low, with an air of professional menace. They dismounted in front of the saloon, their eyes sweeping the street with a predatory gaze. One of the men, a tall, rangy individual with a scar that cut through one eyebrow, turned to face him. "Looking for someone," the man said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Name of Silas Croft." "Heard he was in this town." "He was," Caleb replied, his voice level. "He's gone." The second man, shorter and thicker, with small, piggy eyes, spoke up. "She came, found out Croft was gone, and left on the next train." "She's long gone." He made the lie sound as dull and uninteresting as a page from a ledger book. The man with the scar studied Caleb's face, his eyes narrowed. "Is that a fact?" "Funny. We heard different." "We heard she was still in town. Your information is wrong," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the hard edge of a final warning. "This town is my business. Whoever you're looking for isn't here. I suggest you ride on." A tense silence filled the saloon. The 2 men exchanged a look. They were weighing their options, sizing him up. They saw the badge, the cold confidence in his stance, the way his hand hovered near his gun. They were dangerous men, but they were not foolish. They decided for now to back down. The scarred man gave a slow, insolent smile. "All right, Sheriff. We'll take your word for it." He and his partner finished their whiskeys, threw a coin on the bar, and walked out. Caleb watched them go, his body rigid with tension. He knew they were not leaving town. They would be watching, waiting. The danger he had feared was no longer an abstract possibility. It had a face and a name. He had to get Eleanor on that train tomorrow. Her safety depended on it. The thought of her being in the crosshairs of men like that sent a shard of ice through his gut. It was a fiercely protective instinct, an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for 5 long years. Meanwhile, Eleanor had gone to the general store to purchase a few small necessities for her journey, using the last of her pin money. She was selecting a spool of thread when the doors of the store swung open and the 2 strangers from the saloon entered. An immediate sense of unease prickled her skin. They moved with a predatory grace that was entirely out of place, and their eyes, cold and assessing, swept the store before landing on her. The scar man approached her, his smile unpleasant. "Well now, what do we have here? You wouldn't happen to be a Miss Vance from Philadelphia, would you?" Eleanor's heart began to pound against her ribs. She stood her ground, her chin held high. "I am. Who is asking?" "Friends of Silas Croft," the man lied smoothly. "He sent us. Seems there was a mix-up. He had to leave town sudden-like, but he left something for you. A package. We were told to give it to you." She knew instantly that he was lying. His eyes were cold, and there was no friendliness in his voice. "This was a trap. I know nothing about any package," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that was coiling in her stomach. "Now, if you'll excuse me," she tried to step around him, but the shorter man moved to block her path. "Now hold on, Missy," he snarled. "Our boss, Mr. Thorne, he thinks Croft gave you something that belongs to him. Some deeds, maybe, or a map. We ain't leaving without it. I have nothing that belongs to you or your boss," Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly. "I never even met Silas Croft. I have been deceived and stranded, and I have nothing. We'll be the judge of that," the scar man said, taking a step closer. He reached out to grab her arm. "Leave her alone." The voice came from the doorway, cold and sharp as breaking ice. Caleb stood there, his body framed by the bright sunlight, his face a thunderous mask. His hand was on the grip of his Colt, his thumb resting on the hammer. The 2 men froze, turning to face him. "Sheriff," the scarred man said, slowly raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Just a misunderstanding." "I don't misunderstand," Caleb said, his eyes never leaving them. "I told you to ride on. You chose to stay. Now you're harassing a citizen under my protection. That was your second mistake. Don't make a third." His gaze flickered to Eleanor for a fraction of a second, a silent command for her to move away. She quickly scurried behind the counter, next to the terrified shopkeeper. The tension in the store was thick enough to cut with a knife. The 2 hired guns were caught, their bluff called. They were killers, but they were in the middle of a town, facing down a sheriff who looked like he was carved from granite and fury. They were not ready to die for Marcus Thorne's misplaced deeds. "All right, Sheriff," the scarred man said again, backing slowly toward the door. "We're going." They exited the store, moving backward, their eyes locked on Caleb until they were out in the street. Caleb followed them to the doorway, watching as they mounted their horses and galloped out of town, kicking up a cloud of defiant dust. He knew they would be back. This was just a skirmish, not the end of the fight. He turned back into the store. Eleanor was leaning against the counter, her face ashen, her body trembling. He went to her, his long strides closing the distance in an instant. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he placed it gently on her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. She shook her head, looking up at him. She saw the fierce, protective fire that blazed in his eyes, a fire he could no longer hide. In that moment, she understood. He was not just doing his duty. He was protecting her. The realization sent a wave of warmth through her, chasing away the cold fear. He cared. This cold, distant man cared what happened to her. He pulled his hand back as if burned, retreating once more behind his wall of stoicism. But the mask had slipped, and they had both seen what lay beneath. "Go back to the house," he ordered, his voice tight. "Stay with Martha. Don't leave until I come for you." He turned and strode out of the store without another word, his mind already calculating, planning, preparing for the violence he knew was coming. The rescue was complete, but the danger had just begun, and with it, a connection between them had been forged in the heat of fear and the crucible of his own fiercely denied emotions. That evening, the silence in Caleb's house was different. It was not the comfortable quiet of previous nights, but a taut, strained silence, stretched thin over a current of unspoken fear and turmoil. Martha had tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but even her cheerful bustling could not dispel the tension. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. She kept replaying the scene in the general store, the cold menace in those men's eyes, and the sudden, fearsome appearance of Caleb, a guardian angel armed with a Colt peacemaker. When Caleb finally returned, long after dusk had settled, he carried the weight of the day with him. His face was grim, his shoulders set. He did not sit down. He stood in the middle of the room, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. The ticket for the eastbound train still lay on the hall table, a stark white rectangle in the lamplight. "You have to leave," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion that had blazed in his eyes earlier. "That train tomorrow morning. You have to be on it." Eleanor rose from her chair, her heart sinking. She had known this was coming, but the finality in his tone was like a physical blow. "Because of those men?" she asked, her own voice quiet but firm. "Because they think I have something that belongs to their employer?" "They work for a man named Marcus Thorne," Caleb explained, his tone clipped and professional, as if he were delivering a report. "He's a cattle baron who thinks laws don't apply to him. Croft apparently cheated him somehow, and Thorne is convinced you're the key to getting his property back. As long as you are in this town, you are in danger. They will not stop. And what about you?" she countered, taking a step toward him. "They know you're protecting me. Won't you be in danger as well?" "That's my job," he said dismissively. "It has nothing to do with you. You don't belong in this. This is a rough, violent place. It's no life for a woman like you." There it was. The wall, higher and colder than ever. He was pushing her away, reducing her to a category, a woman like you, a fragile object that needed to be shipped back to a safer, more civilized world. The injustice of it, the dismissal of the strength she had found within herself, ignited a spark of anger. "And what kind of woman is that, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice laced with a new, sharp edge. "A woman who is too delicate to handle hardship? A woman who should run and hide when things become difficult? I have lost my family. I have been deceived and left penniless thousands of miles from my home. Do you truly believe I am so easily broken?" Her words struck him, but he would not relent. He was doing this for her own good. He had to make her understand. He took a step closer, his own frustration mounting. He was trying to save her, and she was fighting him. "I believe you are a woman who was raised for better things. For music and books, for civilized conversation, for a life where your biggest worry is the weather at a garden party. You deserve better than this town." Eleanor, he used her first name, and the sound of it on his lips was both intimate and painful. "You deserve better than a life of dust and fear. And you deserve better than me." The last sentence was a raw, guttural admission, torn from a place deep inside him he kept locked away. It was the heart of the matter. He was tarnished, broken by his past. His world was one of violence and loss. To let her into it would be to condemn her, to taint her with his own darkness. He saw himself as a ruin, and she was a rare, beautiful flower that had mistakenly taken root in the rubble. He had to uproot her, send her back to fertile ground, before she withered and died here with him. Eleanor stared at him, her anger dissolving into a profound, aching sorrow. She saw through his harsh words to the deep-seated self-loathing beneath. He wasn't pushing her away because he thought she was weak. He was pushing her away because he thought he was unworthy. He was protecting her from himself. "You don't get to make that decision for me, Caleb," she said, her voice softening, pleading. "You don't get to decide what I deserve. My old life is gone. There is nothing for me back east but loneliness and pity. Here, for the first time in a long time, I have felt something, a purpose, a connection." Her gaze held his, unwavering. "I'm not afraid of this town, and I am not afraid of you." Her confession hung in the air, a fragile, beautiful thing. It was everything he secretly, desperately wanted to hear, and everything he believed he had to reject. The conflict tore at him. The man who had survived by shutting down his heart was at war with the man who was drowning in a flood of new, terrifying feelings for the woman standing before him. He broke eye contact, turning away from her as if the sight of her was a physical pain. He walked to the fireplace, resting his arm on the mantel, his back to her. "It's not a choice," he said, his voice ragged. "It's a necessity. Thorne's men will be back. They won't be talking next time. I can't protect you if you're here. The safest place for you is hundreds of miles away. And the safest place for you, Caleb? Is it alone?" she asked softly to his back. "Is that what you truly believe? That a life without love or companionship is safer? Or is it just emptier?" He flinched as if she had struck him. She saw the truth, and she spoke it. It was a truth he could not bear to face. He turned back, his face a mask of cold resolve, the internal battle won by the forces of fear and self-denial. "Be ready at sunrise," he said, his voice like stone. "I'm taking you to the station myself." He strode out of the room, not to his own bedroom, but out the front door, into the cold sanctuary of the night, leaving her alone with the flickering fire and the silent, damning ticket to a life she no longer wanted. The dawn broke cold and gray, the sun a pale wafer behind a scrim of high clouds. A heavy sense of dread filled the house. Martha moved about the kitchen with a sad, quiet resignation, packing a small basket of food for Eleanor's journey. Eleanor dressed mechanically, her hands feeling clumsy and slow. Every small action, buttoning her dress, pinning her hair, felt like a betrayal of her own heart. She had argued, she had pleaded, and she had lost. Caleb was immovable, a mountain of stubborn resolve, and she lacked the leverage to shift him. When he came for her, he looked as if he hadn't slept. New lines of exhaustion were etched around his eyes, and his jaw was tight with tension. He did not speak, merely nodded toward the door and picked up her trunk. The finality of the act was crushing. The walk to the train station was a silent funeral procession for a future that had never been allowed to begin. The town was just waking up, smoke curling from chimneys, the air crisp and cold. But as they reached the end of Main Street, the world erupted into chaos. A rifle shot cracked from the roof of the livery stable, the bullet splintering the wooden post just inches from Caleb's head. He reacted instantly, shoving Eleanor to the ground behind a water trough and drawing his pistol in a single, fluid motion. "Stay down," he roared, his eyes scanning for the source of the shot. Another shot rang out, this one from the alleyway beside the general store. The two hired guns. It was an ambush. They had not waited for him to be alone. They had used her as bait. The realization filled Caleb with a cold, murderous rage. "We just want the woman, Sheriff," a voice yelled, the sound echoing in the empty street. "Give her to us, and you can walk away." "Not a chance in hell." Caleb bellowed back, firing a shot toward the livery roof that sent the sniper scrambling for cover. He was pinned down, exposed. He needed to get Eleanor to safety, back to the house. The sheriff's office was too far, too open a run. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and urgent, not taking his eyes off the alley. "When I tell you, I want you to run. Run back to the house and lock the door. Don't stop for anything. Do you understand?" She looked at his face, saw the grim determination there, the willingness to sacrifice himself to save her. And she knew she could not do it. She would not run and leave him to die. "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I'm not leaving you." "Damn it, woman, this is not the time to argue," he hissed, firing another shot that was answered by a volley from both positions. He was outgunned. It was then that Eleanor's mind, sharpened by fear, saw an opportunity. The livery stable's large side door was slightly ajar. Next to it was a stack of empty barrels. "Caleb," she said, tugging on his sleeve. "The livery. If we can get inside, we'll have cover." He glanced where she was pointing, his mind assessing the distance, the risk. It was their only chance. "All right," he said, his eyes meeting hers. He saw no fear in them now, only a fierce, focused courage. "I'll cover you. Run." He stood, firing 3 quick shots toward the alley, drawing their attention. "Now," he yelled. Eleanor scrambled to her feet and ran, her skirts flying, her heart hammering against her ribs. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, the sound of gunfire deafening in her ears. She reached the livery door, fumbling with the latch, and threw it open, diving inside into the hay-scented darkness. Caleb followed, laying down, covering fire as he retreated, then sprinting across the open ground and plunging through the doorway after her. He slammed the heavy door shut and bolted it just as bullets thudded into the wood outside. They were inside, safe for the moment, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The livery was vast and shadowy, filled with the shapes of wagons and the scent of horses and leather. Light streamed in through cracks in the walls, illuminating dust motes that swirled like golden phantoms. "Up there," Caleb said, pointing to the hayloft. "Higher ground." He helped her up the ladder, his hands firm on her waist, and they took cover behind bales of hay. Through a gap, they could see the street, could see the two men cautiously emerging from their positions, advancing on the livery. "They'll try to burn us out," Caleb said, his voice grim as he reloaded his pistol. He only had a handful of cartridges left. Eleanor looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on a large pulley system used for lifting hay bales to the loft, a thick rope dangling from it. An idea, desperate and wild, sparked in her mind. "The rope," she whispered, pointing. The wagons below. Caleb followed her gaze and understood immediately. It was a crazy risk, but it was better than waiting to be shot or burn alive. He met her eyes in the dim light, a silent question passing between them. She gave a firm, determined nod. In that moment, they were not a sheriff and a stranded woman. They were partners, united against a common enemy. He waited until the two men were directly below the hayloft door, their voices audible as they planned their assault. "Now," he whispered. Working together, they looped the rope around the axle of a heavy buckboard wagon directly below them. With all their combined strength, they pulled, using the pulley for leverage. The wagon lifted, groaning a few inches off the ground. "Get ready to fire," he told her, handing her his rifle. "You know how to use this?" She shook her head. "Point at the door and pull the trigger when I tell you." His voice was calm, instructing. He trusted her. He took a deep breath, drew his pistol, and with a final, mighty heave, he and Eleanor released their hold on the pulley rope. The heavy wagon crashed down with a sound like thunder, smashing into a stack of barrels and crates, creating a sudden, violent diversion. At the same moment, Caleb kicked open the hayloft door and began firing. The two men, startled by the noise behind them, were caught completely off guard. Caleb's first shot caught the shorter man in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground. The scarred man reacted faster, diving for cover and returning fire. A bullet whizzed past Caleb's ear, striking the wall behind him. He was exposed. Eleanor, seeing the danger, let out a scream of pure fury and, without thinking, swung the heavy rifle like a club. It stopped, catching the scarred man in the side of the head as he tried to take aim at Caleb again. The blow was clumsy but effective. It staggered him, throwing off his shot. That was all the opening Caleb needed. He fired again, a single precise shot. The scarred man crumpled to the ground, his threat extinguished forever. Silence descended, broken only by the groans of the wounded man and the frantic whinnying of the horses. It was over. Caleb stood there, his pistol still smoking, his chest heaving. He turned to look at Eleanor. She was leaning against a hay bale, the heavy rifle clutched in her hands, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with adrenaline and courage. She had not run. She had not hidden. She had fought. She had saved his life. He went to her, his long strides eating up the distance. He stopped in front of her, and the carefully constructed walls around his heart did not just crack. They crumbled into dust. All his reasons for sending her away, all his fears about his own unworthiness, seemed like hollow, meaningless excuses in the face of the profound, overwhelming truth. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling. He reached out, taking the rifle from her nerveless fingers and setting it aside. Then his hands cupped her face, his calloused thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and she saw everything he had kept hidden: the fear, the relief, the fierce, consuming love. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer deny. "Everything I said, I was wrong." The thought of losing you, of you getting on that train and leaving my life forever, it's worse than any bullet. I love you, Eleanor. I love you, the declaration, torn from the depths of his soul in the aftermath of violence and fear, was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief and joy. "Oh, Caleb," she breathed, her hands coming up to cover his. "I love you too." He lowered his head and kissed her, and it was not a gentle, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made and futures claimed in the dusty, shadow-filled confines of the livery stable. It was a kiss that sealed the end of his solitude and the beginning of their life, a life she had chosen and he had finally, gratefully, accepted. The gunfire had faded, and in the silence, a new world was born. The aftermath of the shootout settled over redemption like a fresh layer of dust. Doc Adams came and patched up the wounded gunman, who, once lucid, was more than willing to testify against Marcus Thorne to save his own skin. Caleb sent a telegraph to the territorial marshal, and by the end of the week, Thorne was in federal custody, his reign of intimidation over. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The immediate danger had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt both peaceful and profound. In Caleb's house, the atmosphere had transformed. The strained tension was replaced by a quiet, tender intimacy. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a shared knowledge that had changed everything. A simple glance across the dinner table, the brush of their hands as he passed her a cup of coffee. Each small gesture was filled with the weight of his confession and her acceptance. Martha watched them with a knowing, satisfied smile, her matchmaking work having been violently completed by Thorne's hired guns. One evening, a few days after the fight, Caleb found Eleanor on the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the night sky. The air was cool and smelled of pine from the distant mountains. He came and stood beside her, not speaking for a long moment, simply sharing the vast, peaceful silence. He had spent so many nights alone on this porch, nursing his grief, but tonight, the solitude was gone, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice a low rumble, "about what you said, about whether a life alone is safer or just emptier." He turned to look at her, his face serious in the pale moonlight. "It's emptier. I've been living in an empty house for 5 years, and I didn't even realize it until you filled it." Eleanor's heart swelled. "It never felt empty to me," she said softly. "It just felt quiet, like it was waiting for something." He reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled out something small. He held out to her on the palm of his calloused hand. It was a simple gold band, worn smooth with time. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice husky. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to Sarah." He paused, taking a steadying breath. "This was harder than facing down gunmen. I put it away after she died. I never thought I'd have a reason to look at it again." He took her left hand in his touch gentle but firm. "I know I have nothing to offer you but a small house in a dusty town, a dangerous job, and a past full of ghosts. I know you deserve palaces and poetry, but if you'll have me, Eleanor Vance, I swear I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve." He looked down at their joined hands, then met her eyes, his own shining with a raw, vulnerable hope. "Will you marry me?" Tears streamed freely down Eleanor's cheeks, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated happiness. She had come to Wyoming seeking a home, and she had found one not in a house or a piece of land, but in the heart of this good, broken man. She had found a partner, a protector, a love she had never imagined possible. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "Oh, Caleb." Yes, he slid the worn gold band onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. It felt as if it had been waiting there for her all along, a link in a chain of love that had been broken but was now repaired. He drew her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her honey-scented hair. He felt the last of the ice around his heart melt away, leaving him open, vulnerable, and more whole than he had felt in years. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the town's small, unadorned church. The whole of redemption seemed to turn out for it. Jed, the station master, stood up as Caleb's best man, and Martha, weeping openly with joy, was Eleanor's matron of honor. The townspeople, who had once stared at her as an outsider, now welcomed her with warm smiles and heartfelt congratulations. They brought gifts, hand-stitched quilts, jars of preserves, a finely tooled leather saddle from the smithy. They were not just accepting her, they were embracing her as one of their own. As she stood beside Caleb, exchanging vows in a clear, strong voice, she looked out at the faces of her new community and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was finally home. The isolation of the wounded loner and the refined pioneer had ended, dissolved into the shared life of a sheriff and his bride, their future as wide and full of promise as the Wyoming sky itself. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, painting the rolling grasslands in hues of gold and amber. The small house Caleb had once described as all he had to offer had grown. A new wing extended from the side, its fresh-cut timber smelling sweetly of pine. The porch was wider now, with 2 rocking chairs and a small swing, and the yard, once bare, was home to a thriving vegetable garden and a profusion of hardy wildflowers that Eleanor had patiently cultivated. The Blackwood Ranch, as it was now known, was no longer just a house. It was a home, vibrant with life and industry. Eleanor sat in one of the rocking chairs, a book resting unread in her lap. Her face, fuller now, held a deep, contented serenity. She was no longer the pale, uncertain woman who had stepped off the train. The sun and the wind had given her a healthy color, and her hands, though still graceful, were now capable and strong. She wore a simple calico dress, and her honey blonde hair was tied back in a practical braid. She watched as a small boy with a shock of dark, unruly hair and his father's stormy gray eyes toddled across the porch on unsteady legs, chasing after a wooden horse Caleb had carved for him. "Easy there, Thomas," she called out, her voice filled with a warm, maternal love. They had named him after the son Caleb had lost, not as a replacement, but as an honor, a way of bridging the past with a hopeful present. Caleb came around the side of the house, having just finished tending to the horses. He had bought the adjoining parcel of land and had started a small but successful horse breeding operation. He still wore the sheriff's star, but the crushing weight of solitude was gone from his shoulders. He moved with a lighter step, a smile touching his lips far more easily than a frown. He scooped up his son in one arm, settling the giggling boy on his hip, and came to lean against the porch railing beside his wife. "He's going to be a rider before he's a talker," Caleb said, his voice full of pride as he watched his son grab for the buttons on his shirt. "He gets his stubbornness from his father," Eleanor replied with a soft smile, reaching out to tuck a stray piece of hair behind his ear. Her fingers brushed against his temple, a familiar, loving gesture. On her hand, the simple gold band gleamed in the fading light, a constant symbol of their bond. She was pregnant again, the gentle swell of her belly a promise of their growing family. Caleb leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that still held all the passion and relief of their first one in the livery. He looked out at the vast expanse of their land, at the majestic peaks of the granite mountains turning purple in the twilight. This was his world, but it was no longer a fortress of solitude. It was a kingdom of love, a sanctuary he had built not with walls, but with connection. "I ever tell you how wrong I was?" he murmured, his breath warm against her cheek. "About which particular thing?" she teased gently, her eyes sparkling with mirth. "Your list of erroneous assumptions was quite long, as I recall." He chuckled, a deep, easy sound that she loved. "About you deserving better than this town," he said, his voice growing serious again. He looked in her eyes, his own filled with a love so profound it still sometimes stole his breath away. "The truth is, this town didn't deserve you. I didn't deserve you. But I thank God every day that you chose us anyway." Eleanor placed her hand on his cheek, her heart full to bursting. "Oh, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We chose each other. And we built this life together. She looked from her husband to her son, and then out at the peaceful land that stretched before them. She had found more than a home in this dusty Wyoming town. She had found her entire world. There is nothing better